Okay, I am here. Hello. Looks like there's a couple of you here. And yeah, there's no one in the waiting room yet for the open mic. So I will start talking about what I think about the debate. So the first thing I notice about the debate is that the topic of whether or not whether or not abortion is murdering people, and whether or not being a living human in the womb constitutes personhood. That topic really wasn't discussed very much at all. Hello, Honesty Angel. I just made you a moderator because I know I can trust you to help out with that. So thank you. And I guess you guys are probably hearing that boop sound. I don't know what's causing that. Oh, Matthew Steele is here. Good. And Brenda. Okay. So, hello, both of you. Welcome.
I'm not hearing a boop sound.
Okay, so it's probably coming from my desktop and isn't quite loud enough for the microphone to hear it. That's good. And Snake
So yes,
is out there.
they did not address personhood. Instead, Kay insisted on talking about human being, but those are two different things.
Yeah, I can definitely entertain discussion on that. And I think what I meant more was that a lot of it was discussing pragmatism. And if we're discussing whether or not it's morally wrong, I think the topic is more whether or not it's murder than whether or not it's pragmatic. And
Do you think it's murder?
I do think it's killing a person without justification.
Yeah, so women who have an abortion should be charged with murder.
I think that would be the ideal circumstance to get to. I don't think that we can start from where we're at now, where I don't think
is that how murder is treated in other cases where the idea of the state is, well, murder is the unjust killing of a human being, but we're not going to worry about that. We're going to get to that later. Is that how that's really addressed in other fields? So why do you hold back on this one? If abortion is murder, then killing an unborn is murder, and you should be charged with murder, and you should be sentenced to death. And the doctor who performs the murder is a murderer, and so is the woman. They should both be charged with murder.
Well, what I gather from the tense of your speech is that none of that was past tense. But I will just say that in the circumstance where at the time that it was done, it was legal, when laws change, we don't go back and hold people accountable retroactively for a future law usually. And speaking biblically as a Christian, I would cite mercy also as mercy being valid. So in order to have an avenue to end these killings, I don't think...
So is that how we address like Jeffrey Dahmer? Do we just let Jeffrey Dahmer go?
Well, Jeffrey Dahmer broke the law at a time when that was
he killed
illegal.
People.
And
it is illegal. Yeah.
And I don't know if he
so
had
presumably
or received mercy on that.
Well, he didn't get the death penalty. That's a different issue. He was definitely charged with murder. He killed people.
Yeah, I already said what I think the difference
Far,
is there. So I
yeah,
don't really.
yeah. He
I'm not
killed.
gonna, Brenda. I'm
He
not gonna
killed.
go in. I'm not gonna go in circles over and over after I already gave my sufficient answer. So if you have a reply for why my answer was insufficient, that I will hear.
Well, the
Sorry, I
question
meant to
is.
unmute you.
The question is whether or not, you know, your preferred legal state of affairs would be that abortion should be illegal, and that anyone who has or performs an abortion is guilty of murder and should be charged accordingly. That would be your preferred state of the legal affairs, right?
Yes. So I'm not proposing retroactive prosecutions after the law has
Yeah.
changed, but I am proposing the change of law.
Yeah. I never suggested you were. That was your false canard.
Okay, so
Right.
yeah,
So
we're not talking about retroactively. We're talking about
right. Right.
bringing the law to a point that from then on, anyone
Right.
who
Right.
commits an abortion is
So
charged
what
for
about
murder.
yeah? So what about a
Mm,
miscarriage?
Miscarriages are not abortions, and also
Mm,
if
you
there
can
is
induce
if
you
there
can
is
induce a
medical
miscarriage.
and if there is medical necessity, then that's also another topic. Um,
Oh,
because
there are medically necessary murders. This is a new concept to me. How can there be a medically necessary murder?
well, it could be medically necessary that one or both of two people die, and there's no way to prevent that. And if that's
Yeah.
the case, then that's not a matter of murder. That's a different type of killing.
Are you essentially saying it's like self-defense?
Am I saying it's self-defense? No, I'm not saying it's self-defense. I'm saying that
Killing to preserve your life, like a,
If-
because that's justified.
what I am saying is that medical necessity is a different topic than when there is no medical necessity involved. So,
it's weird to
I'm not
think that
claiming.
there's such a thing as medically necessary murder. That's just weird to me.
Well, like I said, that is a different topic. That's the entire point I'm making. And so I would like to stay on the topic of on the topic of abortions that are not medically necessary.
Well, she
And
makes
then
a good
if we have
point.
time afterwards, it would be nice to get that deep into the discussion. But I don't see a reason to prevent the discussion, and I'm not going to allow the discussion to be prevented. So we will start by discussing non-medical necessity, and then if we have time afterwards, we'll dig into that side issue of what medical necessity, how that affects our thoughts on the matter.
Well, if I could add real quick, if it's not self-defense, it's kind of like killing the patient next to you for their liver. It is a medically necessary murder, but it saves a life. So if it's not self-defense, then it has to be some other type of thing.
Yeah, if we have, I mean, that topic is more difficult than the topic of abortion than most abortions. So being that it's one side topic and it's even bigger than the main topic, I'm not willing to spend time on that until after we've actually addressed the topic.
Okay. Well,
So
as far as the
bodily,
central topic,
bodily autonomy, that's what you want to discuss more?
I don't know where bodily autonomy comes in. That's not really the way I.
that's a common argument. That's a common argument.
Yeah, I understand that
basically the
other people
reasoning.
use that argument. It's just that we own ourselves and other people own themselves, and people have a right to live, and we have laws around that regardless of whether or not they are able themselves to defend their self-ownership. So like a toddler is not able to defend their self-ownership, but because we recognize their self-ownership, we have laws protecting toddlers. So for me, self-ownership is the more direct way to discuss it. Bodily autonomy is just an abortion promoter tagline. I don't understand where that really fits in.
Well, I think the question is, does the fetus have bodily autonomy?
Okay, then what's the definition of, because like I said, I understand self-ownership and I understand the right to be alive, but bodily autonomy is something I've just heard abortion advocates use to defend something that's false.
Well, that's what
So
I
you would have to explain to me what a bodily autonomy is as something that I recognize.
It's what I use to defend. Yeah, it's what I use to defend libertarianism. But Brenda, you wanted to talk about when someone becomes a person, right? Or gets the rights.
Well,
of
there's
a person.
there's another point. The distinction that I would make is the difference between Kay kept saying that a fetus is a human being, which of course is true, but that's not the question legally in the United States. The question in the United States legally is over whether or not we ought to recognize the unborn fetus as a person. A person is a legal concept, and personhood is accrued to unborn fetuses at a particular stage of development, right after 28 weeks, right? So that's when a fetus becomes a person legally. It is after, well, actually after birth, but we assume that before 28 weeks, you are permitted to abort a fetus, right? Because it's not technically a legal person. So it's about personhood, not about
the real question then is, how are you defining what is and isn't a person? Are you using legal justification or are you using some other moral system of justification? If we're basing our values on only what the law says, I think that is a very dangerous way to approach things. I think that, like definitions, we should use the law as a reference and not a determiner of where limitations are, but rather where they should start and stop when they are correct. So in that way, they're a reflection of the, making something more perfect, and that would be a more perfect society. So there has to be some guiding force, and that brings us back to determining how a human life or any sort of life which is from a human body actually becomes a person that can have rights like a fully developed human being has. At some point, that development occurs. The question is where and when. And I don't think that we can just appeal to the law, because while you guys were talking, I don't want to assume that everyone I'm speaking to is a guy. I just use that in the vernacular. According to the Department of Justice of the United States, murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice. So at the very least, if someone is aborting a fetus, it is manslaughter, not murder under the law, because you're not killing with malice. You are killing without it. Therefore, at the most, it could be
manslaughter. But it's lawful.
Yeah, right. But
it's lawful. It's lawful. Therefore, it's not killing at all. It's lawful, so it's not killing at all.
Right. So the question then is,
so it's not murder at all.
It is killing,
right.
though.
So we have two issues here. We have to decide whether or not something it could be considered murder or manslaughter under the law, and then we have, should it be? So I'm curious from Nicholas, what is the focus of this debate? Because if you just want to talk about abortion in general, that's a very wide topic, and we could be here for weeks. So maybe you could narrow it down.
I appreciate that, Matthew. And I also don't presume that Brenda was using the law as the end of the argument, but it was sounded more like a reference point so far anyway, just as you spoke of, Matthew. And when we're discussing whether it's murder or manslaughter, I think if we kill someone for some form of economic convenience, then that is murder. So if we're going to try to say that that's not malice or to deem malice, I think we're getting hung up too much on the word malice. And yeah, so maybe we should start with just the topic of the difference between different kinds of killing and keep focused on that for a few minutes here and then switch back to personhood, which is a bigger topic.
Okay. All right. As long as we do approach it, because I think that that is a very important distinction that needs to be made. You can't murder something or commit manslaughter if what you're killing is not a person. We have to define that eventually. So I just wanted to make sure that doesn't get forgotten. Thank you.
Yeah, let's just wrap up this discussion of what type of killing, and we don't have to agree at the end, but yeah, I would say if it's for any kind of economic or convenience reason, then that would fall under the category of murder, not manslaughter. To me, manslaughter is meant more for accidental and unintentional deaths rather than claiming an intentional killing is not malice.
We're allowed to kill all kinds of things for convenience or economic reasons. It matters whether it's a justified killing.
But you said all kinds of things. Let's not deliberately get sidetracked here, because we may not have said the word human every time we specifically meant humans, but we did mean humans, and I think we all know that.
Yeah, but you can kill human things too. Like cancer or sperm or eggs.
Well, we're talking about human individuals as in a human, rather than whether or not it's cellular, it's the genetic code of the cells are human. We're talking about if the overall being that is a human being.
So then how do you define it? Is it just any human DNA that has a complete genetic code?
No, we're talking about the entire animal, individual. So when you have separate cells that come off of the whole individual, like I've heard you debate biology before, and I don't think you've ever had problems parsing this out before. So I don't know why it's difficult on this topic to parse it correctly, what an individual is.
Because in biology, it's not that simple. So do you consider the zygote as a separate entity? Is that a human being as you define it?
Well, first, I just want to check real quick if anyone wants to discuss the type of killing anymore, whether it's a matter of manslaughter or murder or anything like that.
It isn't hard. It isn't hard to figure out. This isn't difficult. Killing is taking a life. Murder is unjustified killing. It's a legal concept.
No, murder is with malice.
Well, I think the important distinction is a justified versus unjustified killing. It doesn't matter too much whether it's legal or should it be legal. I mean, eventually down the line, but...
Well, the only other point I think is negligence. So you have matters of negligence, matters of...
Yeah, that would be negligent homicide or negligent manslaughter.
Yeah, and then those are not justified either. So I don't think we need to get stuck up on the different kinds of killing. We understand. We all understand what we're talking about, and it's only when we get more technical than necessary that we are bringing a question to it. So I think we can move on to this whole personhood matter.
Right.
Or, so for me, it's not a matter of personhood. For me, it's a matter of human life. And that's the entire being of a human, not just certain cells. When the interconnected whole of the human is what we're talking about. That's what I'm talking about. So
does a zygote
you
count?
can cut off my foot and all of the cells in my foot will die, but the interconnected whole of the human being does not die.
So I'm allowed to kill your foot?
Well, you're not allowed to cut off my foot. It would not be killing or murder, because we're talking about a human individual. So like when you mention cancer and things like that.
Still unethical though.
Yeah. It's just not the topic of murder. It's a topic of, I guess, I don't know what they call it because it's beyond battery, right? But that's beside the point. So for me, it's not a matter of personhood. It's a matter of human life. So when you have that being who is a human, then I am of the level of moral and ethics that I am not entertaining whether or not that human being might not be a person, so I could have an excuse to kill them. That
So
just
the
never crossed
question-
my mind, and I would rebuke and put shame on anyone if that does cross their mind.
The question is, where does that start?
At conception, when the human being begins.
What defines what a human being is, though? That is, we're not talking about human life. We're talking about a human being.
Yeah, and this is something it sounds like Brenda and I agree on, that when you have a human and they are being, that's a human being, which is why Brenda said the topic is personhood instead of human being. Am I understanding that right, Brenda?
Pretty much. I would say that a unborn fetus is a human being, but before a certain point, it is not a person. Personhood is a legal concept.
Yeah, I'm willing to concede that and switch to just saying personhood. That's fine. It makes no difference to me.
I think you're going to have significant problems practically with defining defining the place where you want to enforce abortion or your anti-abortion views at conception. If you want to do that, that's going to be grossly impractical.
At conception, a zygote is just a piece of literally a piece of a male and a piece of a female, and they fuse. So I don't see how that translates into kind of, that's not what I feel like saying a whole human integrated being is.
And to just, I'm sorry, all I see is a snake. Is this the snake that had the debate on capitalism versus communism the other day?
Yes, this is the very same.
You did very well in that debate. I was very pleased with that.
Oh, thanks.
I would actually agree. I don't agree with communism. I consider that pretty extreme. But yeah. I'm not a libertarian or anything. I'm just an ordinary liberal. But
sorry.
No, go ahead. I didn't have anything to say.
Okay, I just wanted to couple together a couple of points from what Snake was saying with the overall point of contention. If you cut off someone's foot, that is, you are basically damaging an individual by removing a part of it. And if that part of it is equivalent to a foot, then say you have, let's go even smaller. Let's say a toe. So you have one man's toe and one female's toe. And those toes are metaphorically the same as the sperm and egg, which are then forming different cells to become a human being, a blastocyst, zygote, whatever word you want to use for that. But at that point, they're still parts of the people. And the question is, when do they no longer represent parts of the people, the cells from the parents, to become cells of something that can be a person, since we're now talking about personhood?
Yeah, my understanding is that at the moment of conception, the baby begins to build itself using resources provided by the mother. So it has its own unique genetics that's based specifically on what was provided from the egg. It's not getting its genetics from the mother. As its cells duplicate, those cells are duplicating from that individual's genetics, not from the mother somehow duplicating the cells. That's just not what the process is. When blood is introduced, the blood of the mother is not the blood that the baby receives, but the cells of the baby are making its own blood. So really, when a child is growing in the womb, from the moment of conception, the child grows itself. So we have this animal organism that began at that moment. And so the life begins at that moment. And then I don't condone taking human life without necessary justification for doing so. And it's that simple for me. And someone would have to make a very compelling case to put me into the place of taking human life because I'm going to somehow judge who's a person or not. Like in my belief system, the truth itself, which we call God, we have lots of names for that. You guys know that we believe Jesus is that truth itself. But whether you believe it's Jesus or not, it's the truth itself that is the judge of when someone is a person. And I don't need to take that judgment on myself because I can just let human life flourish as much as possible.
That's not how truth works.
But I mean, from our perspective, it's a process, right? It's not. It seems like you think of it more like black and white, off and on. It at this moment, it is a fully human now when its two components just a second ago were separate cells. Now that they've fused into a single cell, all of a sudden it's fundamentally different.
Yeah, at that moment, a process begins, and that process did not begin before. So I see no problem with saying that we can recognize the bodily whole of the conceived animal at that moment. I don't see anything controversial about that. It's simple.
May I interject an analogy to help my understanding of the stumbling block for me is the personhood. We can't even discuss the possibility of killing until we have established that something is a person. And obviously, at a point, personhood is achieved. So
Yeah,
the question is whether or not personhood is an abstract.
Well, personhood is a legal fiction, right? And so we're talking fiction now. And I was just talking about actual facts of truth when we have the recognizable individual animate, an animal that is conceived and begins doing its animal thing. We don't have to step into subjectivities and fictions. We can just respect that human life.
No, we are allowed to set the demarcation line for personhood wherever we please. So we are allowed to. It's a legal fiction, right? So we decide when somebody is a person and when they are not. Personhood has nothing to do with biological reality. It has to do with where humans choose to make the dividing line between personhood and non-personhood. And so far, the dividing line is at 28 weeks, and I think that should remain there.
Personhood is not even the topic, I don't think, because, for instance, animals have personhood, and we can argue that, but I'm not saying that killing an animal is murder under any circumstance.
Animals are not persons.
That's a different argument, because at some point I would say if someone is just like, I guess I would be fine with using the word murder if someone is, say, killing an animal just for fun or something. But
humans might choose in the future to give limited personal rights to some animals, and I think that I would be willing to consider that. I think certain primates and certain cetaceans possibly ought to have limited human rights, right? Maybe we should do that, but that's for us to decide as human beings. It has nothing to do with the real world. I mean, it's simply a fiction that human rights, things like freedom, being against slavery, being for the rights of people of color or women or other people. These are things that humans grant to each other. They have nothing to do with the physical world. They are things that we do socially. We're choices that we make.
I think the question is whether these choices are rational or not.
Yeah, I think Snake is making a good point there. And let me just tell you what I think of personhood, because the word person means fourth sound. So it's a sounding fourth. And then the question is a sounding fourth of what? Because obviously that's a rather poetic way to come up with a word. So when I was still without Christ and a sinner, I was a different person. And I fundamentally, and I mean fundamentally, changed when Christ made me alive. I became a new person. So that person died, and that level of death is more significant than a bodily level of death. So this is how real personhood is to me, is it's more of a valid reality than bodiliness.
You're a
So in a
different,
way, you killed a person.
actually, yes. Yeah.
Well, Christ killed the person, and I'm glad. You must lose your life in order to gain it.
That's a metaphor. I think that's more of a metaphor. I mean, because technically,
It's
you're a
spiritual,
different
which is
person.
not the same thing as metaphor.
No, it's a metaphor. You're a different person than you were last
No.
night. You were a different person yesterday than you are today.
Oh, Brenda, the only thing is that as far as discussing Bible interpretation, if you don't claim even to believe the Bible is fact, then I'm not interested in your interpretation and I'm not going to entertain it. So you can discuss what you think about personhood. That part of it was fine, but when you insisted that the Bible is saying a metaphor, I don't want to waste time on your opinion, because without believing the Bible, it's impossible for you to have given it enough due diligence to be worth me listening to.
Can we try to keep everything on a level of good faith and just all assume we're here to talk about something that's important to us for whatever reason, and no matter what our beliefs are, we're trying to get to the bottom of what is and isn't the case about the morality of legal or otherwise abortion and what we should do with it. I'm personally an atheist, and I believe that the Bible is false, but that has nothing to do with abortion, because it's something that actually impacts the world in a very real way that anyone can have as part. I mean, we all had mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers that could have been aborted. My wife had a child that was very premature at, I believe he was around 22 weeks when he was born, and he is now 19 years old. Now, according to the law, he wouldn't have even gained personhood or being a person until 28 weeks, which means that the first 6 weeks of his life, he was not a person, which obviously there's something wrong there if our technology will support a baby that is 22 weeks old or 21 and a half or whatever he ended up being. If he can survive from that, then he is sustainable. And I think that we have to revise what is and is not legally considered personhood, and therefore when you can apply legal ramifications to killing a newborn child versus killing one that is just on the inside of its mother's belly. There is a point. I disagree that it's at conception for biological reasons, but we have to come to some sort of a realistic, pragmatic conclusion about this, and that's what I'm most interested in talking about. I hope that that's okay.
Well, and there are different Christian interpretations on abortion too. So the religion itself doesn't seem that relevant here, because even if it was, it would be, the religion would be correct based on biological reality in the first place. So that's the fundamental aspect that we should be looking at anyway.
Well, I was speaking of my perspective on personhood and referencing the Bible, and so I said it was not a metaphor, speaking of my perspective. So I guess that was a big part of the problem of insisting that it is a metaphor, is that was like removing me from the discussion, basically, because I was discussing my perspective, and my perspective is that it's not a metaphor. So
And that's
Yeah,
actually kind of interesting.
I was just being defensive of being able to communicate what I'm saying,
No, that's
and
okay.
that I'm not interested in like a totally non-expert correcting what I was saying about my perspective of what Scripture says. But I was not trying to do anything that would shut down the discussion outside of that. I was just defending that I'm expressing how I view personhood in this conversation about personhood. So I was a different person and now I'm a new person. And what Brenda was saying about becoming a new person every day, I think that's relevant to the topic.
Yeah,
So I
I
don't know
think
if you
that's
want to speak
actually
on that, Brenda, at all.
I think that's actually a really interesting example. Like I was saying, it's a process. Are you a fundamentally new person from day to day, or is it like this process of small changes over time so that you can compare 2 points where you can be like, okay, I'm a different person than I was when I was 5 years old, but am I a fundamentally different person from who I was yesterday? I accrue changes, and it's kind of like this, between a zygote and a fetus. It's like where there's no sharp dividing point.
But then there can be sharp dividing points. The difference between when you have not the full human genomic, entity, and it's not multiplying itself to become towards a full adult human. So when
Well,
it's just a sperm or just an egg, there's no process of progress. And then in a certain moment, that automatically running process of progress begins at a very specific moment. So we can measure that. And that was the same thing that happened with my personhood when the previous person died, and that person will never exist again. And now I'm a new person. I've only been two people in my life. And it was a split second when I went from being the previous person to the new one. So that gives some example of how I see personhood, because I don't see myself as a new person every day. I recognize that I've been two people.
so there wasn't a process of convincing you over time into Christ. There was no preamble or preemptive process. You were convinced,
Well,
and the change happened all in the span of a single second.
Well, there were precursors, just as the egg being in the right place and the sperm being launched, and there's precursors. But there's the moment when that genetic individual of the zygote, the human being in its very earliest form, did not exist at all. The two halves were separate, and then that process existed, so the switch was hit. So in the
But
same way, for me personally, yeah, there was precursors that were in place, but there was also that moment when the switch was hit.
but it also seems like that definition is still sloppy because you keep saying the complete genome. So what about children who are missing a chromosome?
Well, now you're just trying to not communicate based on a technicality. We both understand the process of an egg and fertilization and two halves of DNA making the whole human,
But if that's the
progression.
basis of your
So,
definition,
well, I mean, I'm doing my best to communicate. I'm not trying to, prove that I'm able to be technically exact. That's not my intention here. Oh, apparently I have to scroll down to see more people. So we actually have someone who can take some of this heat for me since I've been by myself. So that'll be nice.
It's not really heat. You haven't been given heat. It's just pushback. So
I'm just using a figure of speech. I'm not offended. This has been a fine
a
discussion.
metaphor.
I appreciate it.
A metaphor.
In this case, yeah, that was a metaphor. Yes.
what's up, Noah?
Not much. How are you?
Not bad.
Did you see the debate, Noah?
I just came in right when I said hello earlier, but I did see the topic. So
Did you want to jump in, or are you trying to catch up?
I'm just trying to catch up for right now, but if I do have something to say, I will.
All right.
Well, we already addressed the topic of different types of killing,
Okay.
and hopefully we're past the topic of dealing with whether or not it's human. So now we're on the topic of personhood, which I think we have some very different perspectives on. Hopefully you heard my perspective on personhood and
I
as a
did hear that.
Christian understood it. Wait, what'd you say, Noah?
I said I did hear that.
And then for me, personhood isn't really the matter of sanctity of life, because we're talking about the life of a human being, which to me is not the same thing as the life of a person. I've been two different persons, but I've only been one human being when we talk
Mhm.
about this animal continuity of an overall organism. And that begins at conception. And for me, I'm not looking for any excuse to be allowed to end that based on how I might define whether or not that life is worthy of being kept alive or not, which is what we're talking about with the legal fiction of personhood, I think.
I think that the process you can kind of start it at conception, but really it's parts. The continuity is unbroken. It's a cell that continues life from the mother and from the father, and it fuses with the mother, and then eventually it breaks with the mother, but we actually recognize it as a separate entity before it breaks with the mother because it's a process. It's not. There's no clear delineation.
Well,
And-
may I ask
And
you
if
something? then,
it's yeah, hold just one sec. If you're saying that the clear delineation is at the point where the two cells fuse, then it would seem that if we have a child who is born with less of a chromosome or an incomplete genome, that kind of throws off the definition there as well.
Well, I was making it, I was defining it based on when that process begins autonomously. I hope autonomously is the right word, that it's automatically the individual progressing itself towards its mature state that we know as an adult. So
Well, then that's
let's
at
take
the
it to
moment
the
of
other end.
ejaculation then.
Let's take it to the other end of life. And I mean, are we going to have this much trouble defining whether or not someone's dead because
Well, actually,
because of this whole chemical wedding idea that they're just going
yes,
back
that can
to the earth? So then we don't know if a person's dead. We don't know if we should have a funeral because as far as chemistry goes, we can say that it's still a gradual thing chemically.
yeah, people have woken up in the grave after being declared dead. They had no heartbeat.
I think that the fundamental issue here, whether you believe the Bible is true or not, whatever your position is on personhood, whether it's at conception or looking at it as Snake seems to be doing, as a continuous process of life functioning in various ways, I think that the fundamental issue here is whether or not we can realistically assign a point of delineation based on the biology alone where a person is made. I think the problem there is that person is also a fiction. It is an idea, an abstract that we are assigning to a collection of other things. So if you're saying that the person is the collection of the cells that are forming a zygote at the moment of conception, then that is your definition of a person, including the process and all of the resources that are going to eventually create a baby which can be born. But I think that it requires more. There are more processes, there are more parts involved in the collection of that umbrella term, and it's like saying economics. You're actually talking about all the money and all the transfers, the interactions, the day-to-day movements from physical space that people are making. It's all a big system. So when you're talking about personhood, you're talking still about a system, because a body is a system. It's all parts that are working together as a whole. So at the point of conception, you're saying that the zygote that is created from the man's sperm and the woman's egg is a person. But you're also, it seems to me, and I don't mean this in any way as if you're being disingenuous, but it seems like you're adding in the amount of time and the eventual product that will result from the zygote. You're adding in all of the next, say, 9 months or whatever period of time that would be before the baby was born as part of what is essentially initially only a couple of cells. So the person is an incomplete. It's adding ideas to the biology as well as time, the passage of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Well-
I think I was pretty clear that for me it's not about personhood. I did describe using examples what personhood is to me.
I
But
definitely.
for me, it's about human life.
Well, and to add to that a little bit, between a third and a half of all fertilized eggs do never implant and just get washed out. So is this like a serious, like half of pregnancies by your
Holocaust.
definition? Yeah. Then we
It's a
should raise miscarriage to like unbelievable amounts.
Well, that's new information to me that as far as the detail. So the detail
an interesting
the
point.
detail you're giving me here is that rather than just not conceiving, that it's very common that conception occurs, but then we could just say doesn't take. Is that what I'm hearing?
They fail to implant into the uterine wall. That happens rather commonly.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that uncommon for a fertilized egg to fail to implant.
Up to
Yeah.
half the time.
Yeah, and for me, that doesn't change the discussion of whether or not we want to start drawing lines on when we're going to end human lives.
I don't think that we can avoid that. I don't think we can avoid making an arbitrary decision by humans as to when we are going to say that a unborn fetus is a legal person. I don't think that can be avoided, and I don't think you can. Appealing to biology is simply not going to help. I think appealing to scientific facts can help us make that decision, but it's not going to be decisive. I'm not sure. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, the discussion about when we should or should not hold a life as I'm just going to use the word sacred to keep it simple. So, like, how I'm defining sacred in this context is, murder is a crime because we consider all lives sacred. So the word sacred means set apart. So they're set apart is something we're not allowed to destroy. Like you can destroy an empty beer bottle.
Actually, I agree.
Yeah, okay.
I agree. I actually agree that once somebody is a human being, once somebody is a person, we should respect that person and treat them accordingly. I'm against capital punishment for that reason. I don't think that we should go about killing people who have committed crimes, even heinous crimes, right? I don't think so. So, and I think that we should hold people, human beings, persons, sacred, and that there should be consequences in the government for that. For instance, we should have laws that respect the rights of human beings. But the question of when we decide a fertilized egg becomes a person is going to have to be made by us. And I don't think that there's any way to avoid making a difficult decision.
Well, it's kind of like if you have the frame of a building, is that a house? What if you just have the concrete foundation poured? Or is a house only when the final nail goes in? I think it's somewhere in between. Same with a human or anything that is a developmental process. But there's no line where you can say now it's a house.
Well, it's put in philosophy as the problem of the heap, which is you can have one thing and then you have two things and three things, and at what point does a pile of individual things become a heap or a collection of things? And as far as I'm concerned, it's simply an arbitrary distinction. How many hairs on your head do you have to have before you're bald? If you have one hair, would you say you're bald? Or is it 2 hairs or 3 hairs or 1,000 hairs? At what point are you bald? And that's just going to be an arbitrary decision, right? We're not going to be able. There's nothing to appeal to. We just make a choice.
And if we could put some of this on pause for a minute, I'd like to hear from Noah if you have any overall thoughts on the overall topic or anything that you'd like to say. I'd like to give you the floor for a minute here.
I'm still chewing on the whole uterus thing. Maybe we should, like I'm on your position, at least have been, that life starts at conception, but I don't know. It's interesting. For me anyway, life is sovereign, and I believe God creates all things. So I don't have a problem with the conception thing, and I feel like if it is indeed a Holocaust, then that's the will of God. But that's neither
I
here
don't
nor
have a
there.
problem. I don't have a problem with saying life begins at conception. Well, actually, life continues at conception, right? I don't have a problem.
It is alive.
But yeah, the question is, when does it become a person?
When we say life begins at conception, we're talking about an individual human. So, for instance, we know that, like, even though my life is a continuation of my parents' lives, my parents and I are different individuals. So, when we say it begins at conception, we're talking about an individual. I don't think we need to complicate that, do we?
Well, it is complicated because it becomes a part of the female's body.
Well, I mean, in context of what Brenda was saying about continuing as opposed to beginning. Like, if we're saying it's continuing, then we're saying I am my parents, and we're saying that, like, we can't, whether we're discussing it personhood wise or biological wise, if we can't say begin, then it's like we can't recognize that I'm a separate individual.
There's a real sense in which that's true. You are a continuation of your parents. You have the phenotypical traits inherited from your parents. They came from your nose, your eyes, your ears, your skin color, whether your hair is straight or wiry, fat distributions, bone structure. All these things come from your parents. So you are a continuation of your parents. There's a sense in which we want to say we're individuals, but there's a sense in which we're not.
But there's also a sense in which we are. So I'm just saying that when we say begins at conception, we're talking about the biological individual, is what I'm saying. I'm not denying that there's another perspective to take. I'm just clarifying communication so that we can hear each other and keep talking.
Nicholas,
no, I understand.
I'd like to just ask you to clarify something, if I may.
Yeah.
If we're speaking of biology and individuality among other members of our species, could I make analogies with animal species or plants, or just to compare one type of life to another and how they are unique from each other? Or is that something that can't even be used for this sort of classification of personhood and individuality for you? Because of your...
Well, I was only clarifying what we mean by when we say life begins at conception, because I agree with Brenda that you can say life continues at conception. So I was just clarifying that one piece of communication. That's all I was doing with that.
I'm just asking, like, to help communication, if I were to make an analogy of like a tree being part of a forest or a human being part of a society, the analogy that would be drawn from that is that the individual is smaller pieces of a larger whole. And if we're saying personhood is in the same way that we generate legal fictions for the law, abstract ideas are, in a sense, name tags that we're putting on something where you've got a cluster or a group of things that you're then calling something else.
Yeah, as Christians, we have an easy answer to that because humans are made in the image of God.
Okay.
And so
Mhm.
Christians disagree with you about Christians don't completely agree on the abortion issue. Plenty of Christians think abortion is just fine.
Well, I'm not really. I'm here as an individual who follows Messiah, and I can speak on my behalf and on behalf of God and on behalf of Messiah. Their spirit is in
I
me.
don't think that
I don't
I
have
don't
the
think you can
spirit. I
speak
don't have
on
this.
behalf of.
I don't have the spirit of every person who calls themselves Christian in me. So that's not really something I can even speak on, and
So
it's not what I'm here to do.
Nicholas,
Christian can be nominal too. Just because someone says they're Christian doesn't necessarily mean that they hold to the values of Christianity.
yeah, but then we run the risk of straying into no true Scotsman fallacies. So
Yeah,
let's
and then we got to think what defines a Scotsman. They've got to be human, male, and something to do with Scotland. So Christians are defined by something to do with Christ. So yeah, we're not necessarily doing a no true Scotsman fallacy when we say that some people are not Scotsmen. We're not doing a no true Scotsman fallacy if we say some people are not Christian. But I'd rather just avoid that and speak on my behalf and
right.
say what my perspective of God is, and you guys can argue with me and not try to straw man me with other people.
No, Nicholas, I'm an old hand at this. I've been around for a long time, and I've talked to thousands of people. I've talked to people who believed they were God. I've talked to.
Well, now you're talking to me, and we're talking about abortion. I do not want to go on this tangent. It sounds like.
No, I'm not going on any tangent. I am trying to emphasize that when I talk to someone about their beliefs, I'm focused on their beliefs, not what anyone else has had to say. So I think what would help for us to
It was Brenda who brought up what other Christians think, and we were clarifying.
right, but
So there's just been a lot of clarifying going on here, to tell the truth.
I'm just saying I don't think it's a slam dunk that if you're a Christian necessarily you are against abortion. I don't think that's a slam dunk.
Oh yeah, I'm just communicating and saying that there was a specific question brought up about communities, forests, stuff like that, and I was responding to that question by saying that we have an easy way to that we say that humans are made in the image of God. So it's not that nations are made in the image of God.
Well,
so just expressing myself, I have that to stand on.
Okay, so are you someone who acknowledges evolution of human life from, say, other previous primates, or are you someone who believes that humans were created in their exact form now?
I believe we're created in our exact form now.
Okay, well, that makes it more difficult than if we're talking about life being a process. The process, if the point of delineation for you is that there was a hard start for where a person starts being a person, then it sounds like your position is also that people had a hard start where they started being people. But I would argue that if we go with the prevailing theory in biology, it's that the process of life is changing from one form to another, the same way that a frog starts out as a tadpole, and then it's a tadpole that's got legs, and then it's a frog with no tail. That sort of progress on a longer scale is how, at what point do you stop calling it a tadpole and start calling it a frog? We're kind of dealing with the same issue here with deciding when something is no longer just a couple of cells and is now an individual. I think that point of delineation is not so clear if we are not starting with the idea that we are unique from everything else in biology.
I think we're very far from discussing the moment of conception and discussing whether that life is sacred at that point. I was really just addressing the difference between individuals and communities so that we did not have to get so lost from the topic. But it seems like it's just been taken that way even further unnecessarily. And there's one thing I just want to say about all three of you that I think I don't really think we have a large audience here listening, but I think that rational people who are listening can see how there is a whole lot of at times going into some pretty absurd ways to use philosophy and words to try to justify this. And I'm not talking about everything you guys have said, because sometimes, like when you just say things about like when does personhood begin and that sort of thing sounds very rational, but some of these discussions about if I say that the process, the biological autonomous process of a human life, that for me at that point, I'm not going to try to say, well, it's not sacred yet, and I'll be the judge of when it's sacred enough to be worth protecting. Then when Snake goes into an analogy about building a house and stuff, I think some of the desperation of some of those examples is kind of very clearly exposed to people who are listening. So while we're all saying our own side and letting everyone else say their own side, I think we should I just want to point out that like these sides are being seen for what they are. They're not necessarily convincing people.
Well, it convinced the Supreme Court, at least.
When they're established by evidence rather than just presuppositions, then it becomes even more clear. And when you apply critical thinking to how we are defining our terms and how we are arriving at our conclusions, then it is definitely clear which position makes more sense. And that is what we were having this discussion for, right? Because if we're just here to argue about positions that will not ever change, then I'm happy to just have a discussion, but I was here just to try to discuss the topic and not step on anyone's toes. But if everyone's minds are closed to the possibility that they're wrong, then I'm going to have to bow out. I came here in good faith and have no reason to argue in bad faith with anyone about anything, not even someone who takes the Bible as literally true. And I'm sorry if I've offended you, but it wasn't my intent.
Well, to address
that's not the point. I was just making a statement that I think a lot of these discussions that we've all been very polite about, certain points have been very, very weak, and they show themselves to be weak. And I just wanted to shine light on that. Yeah.
Well, to address that, you could argue that ejaculation begins the autonomous process, because on its own, the sperm seeks out the egg, and on its own, the egg drops down the fallopian tubes. After ejaculation, there's nothing the human can do to really. I mean, you could interfere with it, you could wash it out, but it proceeds on its own.
Yeah, and that's sort of hyper focusing on the word autonomous instead of attempting to hear the overall expression of what I'm trying to say. So, like I said, I'm not really here to prove that I'm so good with words that I can pin things down with perfect technicality. I'm just here to express my perspective the best I can. So, yeah, just because you can keep finding ways to not hear what I intend to say, I don't think shows any weakness in what I intend to say.
I don't think anybody has misunderstood you.
Yeah, I'm not trying to misunderstand you or try and twist your words, but I do take your words at face value. And especially if we're talking about science.
So the human individual is what I'm speaking of. And we know human individuals to have their own unique genetic code, and the sperm and egg do not have that fullness of genetic code. So
Yeah, but
you see,
in-
biology is giving us a point where this is easy to delineate. And while we can keep using words and technical observations to dodge how easy it is to delineate that moment, it is easy to delineate. The human individual life begins at conception, and we can discuss whether or not personhood begins
I
then.
don't
But
think
like
you've
I
shown
said,
that.
in my belief, I'm not the judge of who's a person or not.
I don't think you've shown that it's easy to delineate at all. You haven't shown that.
Okay, that's fine. I
Yeah, 'cause
mean, maybe
I'm
I haven't shown
struggling.
it. I've done my best to express it. Biology itself shows that it's easy to delineate. Biology doesn't need
I
me
think
to prove it.
I think we've pretty effectively shown that that's not true.
Well, I completely disagree.
Yeah,
Well,
that's fine.
when you say a full genome, we can point out that it's fuzzy because some children are born without complete genomes, and you'd say that those rights should be protected. When you
Well,
say
if
that it's a
they're able to
different
be born,
unique genome, then we can point out, well, cancer has its own unique genome. So this is why I use the house example. Like, I know you're saying maybe that doesn't apply because it's not autonomous or it's not alive, but if you could point out, when does a house become a house? Is it when the first plank is laid? Then maybe we could figure out how a process can be nailed down to a single point of starting.
yeah, and I mean, we're all able to like look at biology, and I mean that, of course, in a kind of figurative sense. You know, we can look at the biological facts and assess them. So, like, cancer is not a human individual, and if a child is born with quote one less chromosome, well, their genome is complete. And we see that it's complete because it has done its job to make a child. So you're just taking complete out of context. You're putting that into a different context that's not relevant.
Well, when you say individual, that has certain criteria, and I'm just trying to figure out what those criteria are.
Yeah, and it's obvious that I am unable to explain that to you. So then it's time to move on from that. Now, I know that Noah and I have this perspective based on life and holding life sacred. And it sounds like Brenda instead has a perspective on personhood and holding personhood sacred.
I hold all life sacred, if you want to put it that way. Yeah. So I would respect and want to hold. It depends on what you mean by sacred. I would hold plant life sacred. Plant life is why I'm able to breathe oxygen, right? So I very much want to respect and hold up plant life, because without it, I have nothing to breathe. And I think that you can respect and hold sacred life in all of its forms. It's just that I think that at certain points, it is perfectly acceptable for people to terminate a fetus because for various reasons.
Well, let's see if we can agree on what we mean by sacred in this context, because the word sacred means set apart. So in this context, I'm talking about set apart, that it's illegal to murder. So like with plants, we don't give that same set apartness of illegal to murder.
It's always illegal to murder, because that's what it means for something to be murdered.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that plant life is not in that category. It's not set apart in that way. So, like I said, I'm trying to pin down the context of sacred that we're using here, so that we can have.
There's some animals that I think that maybe we should place legal restrictions on killing them. I definitely think, and in how they're treated, I think certain animal forms should be treated with more respect than we do now. Yeah. And in fact, although I'm not, there are people who are vegans who hold all animal life in highest regard. I take sacred to mean holding in high regard. I hold
Brenda.
all life in high regard.
What I'm trying to get at is rather than just me and Noah sort of coming at, I think we've done a pretty good job, or I've done a pretty good job of expressing what I mean about when the human life begins, and I've cited that I'm not going to hold myself as the judge of when that life becomes sacred to not kill it. And I've expressed that the Bible gives us an easy way to make that claim also. So what I'm trying to do is open the floor for the discussion of why that sort of sanctity that we're not going to kill the individual should wait until 28 weeks perhaps, or just for you two to talk about that topic in context of abortion and a life in the womb. And yeah.
Well, you might even say that because it's an autonomous process, then there should be kind of a leeway there to kind of push the rewind button on that, since it is a involuntary bodily process that you have the choice to stop before it even happens. So if it proceeds on its own accidentally, maybe there should be a little bit of leeway to go, like, kind of take that back a little bit, since the being that is the zygote is far more similar to the sperm and egg that are touching each other just prior to fusion than that zygote is to a grown fetus. They're more similar beings.
I don't see an objective metric of similarity as being relevant in this case, nor am I sure that that's even true, because you have this full genome, which I know you have excuses for, defining full differently than I do or something, but hopefully I cleared that up. So you have this full genome, and you have these cells that self-duplicate as cells of part of a human being, whereas sperm does not self-duplicate in that way, and an egg does not self-duplicate in that way. So I see the cells of a zygote as being very similar to human cells and not very similar to sperm or egg. So I don't even think your point is correct, even if...
Well, the whole fetus doesn't self-duplicate either. And a sperm has its own function. Maybe it's not duplication, but it does have an autonomous function of seeking out an egg.
Well, I'm talking about the similarity in the cells, because you're claiming that the zygote is more similar to the sperm or egg, but it gets
we could just start with cell count.
A type of cell that is much more similar to my cells than it is to what a sperm or an egg is. So I'm just going to say that you're totally backwards on what you think is more similar or not.
Well, the only difference there is half of the genome is right outside the egg versus inside of its membrane. Like, so what if this is being very pedantic, but what if you were just talking about the moment in time where the two membranes are fused, but the two genomes have not fused yet? Does that make any difference to you?
Okay, you're talking about nitpicking split moments in time, but this discussion of abortion does not happen at that split moment that we can nitpick. It happens later enough that that's irrelevant.
But you're saying that it is a split moment in time anyway.
Well, a split moment in time in context, because, we get down to it. The theoretical single quantum moment is the only time you theoretically can have that single split moment in time. So this is the kind of technical dodging that I'm honestly not very interested in what Brenda wants to discuss about personhood versus the earlier life before she would consider it a person. And that kind of discussion of human rights is something I'm much more interested in. I think we're wasting a lot of time nitpicking biology.
You asked me how are they more similar, and that's how they're more similar is because really the only difference would be like the position of their membranes. Because you're saying that if they're just touching each other on the outside, that's not a new human life. But after a couple of
you
seconds,
were speaking about the zygote, and by the time it's a zygote, the two genomes merge, right? Am I misunderstanding that? So now you're changing the topic away from the zygote, which I never changed the topic away from the zygote when I was talking about similarity to which one?
yeah, I'm saying is the zygote versus the moment before it becomes a zygote are more similar than the zygote and the fetus.
Oh, so you're switching what it's similar to
No?
from... Okay, well, I mean, honestly, I just consider that irrelevant. And yeah, I don't really know what more to say on that.
Because you would say that it's fine to stop them if you could to separate the two that are about to fuse, but it's not okay to stop them between the 1 second where they actually do fuse.
See, I
mean,
personally would have a problem with contraception for that reason.
Yeah, and I can totally go. I can totally go that direction with Noah, except that I would not legally say that we're at grounds to tell others not to use contraception.
Right, and yeah, I wouldn't push that on people. That's personal belief.
So we're at something that's pretty irrelevant because we're getting extremely nitpicky about what the moment of conception is. But by the time we're talking about abortion, we have plenty that we can agree on. So, I mean, you're at this point, Snake, this is just totally derailing the discussion about abortion.
It matters because what if you used spermicide, but it didn't kill all the sperm? You took the necessary precautions that maybe if you accept contraception, that it shouldn't have proceeded into a zygote. So, but what if it does? It's an accident.
Well,
are we not allowed any leeway on that?
This gets into another topic that I do have plenty to say on. But first, like I've said a couple times now, Brenda still has stuff. It seems like Brenda still wants to express regarding
I don't know.
personhood and life and stuff. Unless you feel like you've already.
If you want to continue, with Snake, that's fine with me. I mean, it just seems to me that you're the one who's making the determination that life begins at conception, and you want the law to reflect that. And so I think Snake's questions are on point.
Okay, and then, well, do you feel that you put forth any kind of philosophical justification for your 28 weeks idea? Because I don't remember hearing that.
My understanding is that 28 weeks is the current law, right?
I don't know.
28 weeks after conception is the current law, is when abortions are, first trimester, it's 28 weeks, and that's when it's legally permissible to have an abortion for any reason. And after that, there need to be extenuating circumstances like the life of the mother and other things like that.
Okay, so it sounds like what I'm hearing there is that we're having sort of the quintessential clash between those who think that there's an objective truth of the universe that has the final authority, and there's those who think that because there's not an objective truth of the universe, or that truth does not speak on this topic, that humans have the authority, and they use cultural, social means to determine.
Yeah, I don't know I don't know when you talk like that what you mean, because truth isn't a person. Truth is just the property of a sentence. The ball is red is a true statement, right? So the statement is true. That's what truth means. There's no other meaning. There's no other meaning to truth.
And this is the quintessential disagreement that I'm talking about. So, but what I'm talking about is that you're saying that there is not an objective standard for this exact topic. So you're appealing
Truth?
to
No, there is.
humans together. Well, for the exact topic of 28 weeks being the moment, as opposed to 24 weeks or
Well,
32
people
weeks.
have reasons, and it has to do with the development of the fetus, and that was all hashed out in Roe v. Wade and testimony before during that time,
So we're
right? They
citing
hashed out.
So we're citing human authority is where this philosophical justification comes
We have,
to its end.
yeah, we have the right. We have the right to decide. Yes, we do.
Okay, so now that we established that, I think our side has expressed a few different grounds that we say life begins at conception, and we're not going to judge whether or not we're not going to judge to wait until later to make it sacred at some time. And then you have said that humans do have that right and role to make that judgment of when it becomes sacred.
Yeah, I think we do.
Okay, and then what Snake was getting at is, well, let me give a little space for Noah for a moment before we jump back into that. If you want any space to say something, Noah.
I'm good. I think you laid it out pretty nicely.
Well,
Okay.
from my perspective, I don't know if we necessarily have the right to choose. I think it's more of a duty. We have to choose, or else we're just going to let anyone do whatever we want. We have to have some kind of decision-making process.
Yeah, and I tried to put that in there when I used the word role. So I said we have the right and role to do that. But yes, I hear you.
And I could even be convinced, like, 28 weeks may be too long. Maybe we could protect it a little earlier. Like, I almost lean towards that, but I can't be convinced that the moment of the zygote is when we should cut it off. It's somewhere in between there. And since it's such a vague and gradual process, it's hard to actually draw a line, because there's no single step that is instantaneously fundamentally different.
Well, we can draw the line at, say, 5 minutes before conception to 5 minutes after conception, and then I don't know if when we're discussing abortion, we're actually discussing the nitty-gritty of those 10 minutes in the middle. So as far as biological recognition, I think conception is recognizable enough for this topic.
Well, so then there's no...
That's the final say on it, but I'm saying that it is recognizable enough. We don't need to pretend that it's hard to recognize conception, is all I'm saying right now.
Well, it's hard to recognize that that's fundamentally different from 1 second preconception. And so if you're only going to give 5 minutes leeway, then there's no ability to realize that you've made a mistake or the contraception failed. And so if you're going to allow contraception, which I think you have to, or else having a period is murder, then you have to allow someone to kind of correct the mistake if the contraception failed, up to a point.
Yeah, and then that's where we get into the other side of this discussion, which is
God is sovereign.
well, I'm actually going with because I think we could just like keep preaching that over and over, and we don't have any common ground of God to talk on, but God is truth, and so we can talk about aspects of truth and find common ground there, and hopefully do something beneficial with the discussion still.
Yeah, that's not how truth works.
Yeah, if it's true, then it's true outside of because God said so.
So, yeah, well, if there is a God, God is truth. So, I mean, not to force
persons aren't truth. Truth isn't a person. That's just nonsense. That's doing violence to words and meaning.
I think personhood is more like a tool. that we can use to gauge.
Yeah, and then you see, I believe just like there are abstract facts. So there's, say, for instance, the law of non-contradiction. There are the facts of math. There are abstract facts. And so
Yeah, and we don't need to rely
when
on
we
God
recognize-
saying that that's true for us to understand why it's true.
I'm saying that there's an abstract fact Brenda is unaware of, that truth is a person, and Brenda is not aware of that fact. So so you say I'm doing violence
Fine.
to words,
Yes,
but
yes.
we just disagree on that, is what I'm getting at.
Well, there's absolutely nobody in mathematics, logic, or philosophy who actually thinks that truth is a person. Nobody believes this.
Well, I think probably almost every Christian who is in those fields believes that. So, I mean, there are people who believe that. That's just a false fact you stated. But the way I can address what you're talking about, Snake, is a matter of the woman should be able to reverse it if it accidentally happened. What we're getting into here is
Yeah, if you're going to allow 5 minutes leeway.
as a biological contract. And so obviously this is not a literal contract between persons. So contract here is a metaphor of sorts. And by
Well,
this,
and it also brings up the most, well, one of the most common objections is if this was not a consensual impregnation.
yeah, and in the system of law that was given to us by God, rape is punishable by death. And but we would not punish, and we don't, also in the law that's given to us by God, we do not punish children for their parents' crimes.
Yeah. I think
So,
that's horrendous. I think that's a monstrous point of view. And I don't agree. Laws aren't given to us by God. Laws are created by humans to address human needs.
Well, this set of laws is given to Israel by God.
Yeah.
And
Supposedly.
and I know you disagree, but that's the perspective I'm speaking from. And so to think that that a woman can kill her child in response to a crime committed by a grown man who's the child's father, well, in our law that's not permitted, because you don't punish children for the crimes of the parents.
Well,
But
that is
since it's
it is
only
permitted.
Since
go
it's
ahead.
only like a small developing part, like literally the smallest part of a human, then it's more like just taking it a step back so that this thing that was imposed on her doesn't happen.
I mean, there's a lot of things we could do that we could find a way to describe them as just a step back, and then the individual an individual is killed by it. So, like, you know,
Why should
like
why
what?
should
well, I want to respond to what Snake is saying. Like, let's say I pick a stone up off the ground, and then it's a huge stone as big as I'm able to lift, something like 50 pounds. And then someone puts a baby under it. And then I just let that stone rewind back to the ground, just to step back to the ground. Well, really, I'm murdering a child. So a lot of these technical dodges are just completely irrelevant.
But you could put the stone down without murdering the child. I agree that if you could take the zygote out without killing it, then killing it is completely unnecessary and ethically not justified. But
Yeah, and I want to discuss all this. It's just like when we get into unnecessary tangents, like you can call it a step back. And I mean, that point is, I'm just saying that point fails. I'm not trying to shut down the discussion. And so what I propose is that there's a
Why
sort
should-
of a
I have a
biological.
question.
Yes, Brenda?
Why should a woman be forced to carry her rapist's child? I don't think that that's moral at all.
The immorality is on the part of the man who raped her. The
Yes, yes.
immorality is not on the part of having laws against murder.
So
we
his
should
desire.
force.
Go ahead.
We should. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
Well, hold on
we
real
should
quick.
force the
I want to say-
rapist's actions to be worse over a long period of time.
Well, my point is that anything that's tragic about this is caused by the wrongdoing of the rapist, and to try to say that because murder is illegal, and
you're just-
I know that I'm jumping the gun on the definition of murder, but I'm just saying how this is an irrelevant point to our discussion.
No, but you're just allowing his crime to continue.
Well, I can't prevent everyone's crimes from having consequences.
But we can prevent the fertilized egg from becoming a person.
Well, except that then we would have to end human life. So now we have to talk about.
There's nothing wrong with ending human life. Governments do it all the time. People do it all the time.
Yeah, but it's not just to end a child's life because their parent committed a crime. So that would be an unjust killing, which would be a murder.
No, it's only unjust if you deem it unjust. I don't deem it unjust. I deem it as just.
And I see it more as a tiny part of a child that isn't a child yet. And I don't see much of a difference between getting rid of this small part and never allowing it to happen in the first place.
And then this small part. Okay, well, we've discussed about our perspectives on what's a human life or not. So I'd like to get into this new topic where you talk about the ability to undo accidentally letting it happen. So I see that that's very cleverly shaped, that sort of approach to it, because if someone's just not even using contraception and stuff, and then they're going to blame the human who's created for being created, that's not right. So then we're getting into, well, what about when you actually do take the responsible measures? And what I say is that pregnancy is a risk of sex, and if you are not willing to take that risk, then you have the option to not have sex.
Well, actually, from the Christian perspective, wouldn't it be more ethical to create it than to not have created it in the first place? Because under Christianity, you would just be sending it straight to heaven, and you'd be forgiven for any sins if you honestly repent for it. So I don't see how that's that much of a problem in the end, in the first place. But from like a secular perspective or atheist perspective, it's like there's no difference between if it was never created in the first place and if you just nip it in the bud slightly after it was created.
Okay, and let's pause for a second on the Christian perspective, because anything going from the Christian perspective then is required to be obedient to Christ, who came only to speak the will of his Father. So then it must be obedient to God. So then we would have to discuss what God has to say about it.
Yeah,
Which
but God forgives sinners, so.
Well, as far as if God's going to permit us to decide that based on our best judgment, someone is in a place of being saved at this moment. So if they die at this moment, they're good. Then, in theory, if someone could lose their salvation, which is not what I believe, but kind of steel manning your case here, maybe, I don't know, just doing my best to have this discussion. If someone could lose their salvation, it's better to kill them before they lose their salvation so that they'll actually be saved rather than live long enough to do something wrong and lose their salvation. So now we're talking about like weird justifications for murder from philosophy. What the scripture actually says is not to be taken captive by vain philosophy and to be obedient to God. And so I don't really see how we're going to set philosophical premises and then say that because they're Christian premises, we can do whatever we want from there. That would not be Christianity. So, I mean, it might be easier if we just don't make weird straw men about Christianity and we try to stay more on common ground.
Well, I'm not saying you believe this, but I've actually heard on I forget whose channel it was. It might have been on SFT. But I've heard, he didn't say this, I don't think, but that the genocides in the Bible were justified because you're sending those children straight to heaven and preventing them from being raised by pagan hooligan
Yeah.
parents.
William Lane Craig has made that argument too. Yeah.
It's a weak
You're
argument
just-
too.
So
You're
it's
just
a common, yeah.
Sending children to heaven. Yeah.
Yeah, I would never make that argument. My belief about the judgment and about Christ's victory and the gift he's given to all humankind is a lot more grandiose than this us and them. Some of us are saved, some of us are not. I don't know this for sure. There's a lot of stuff in Christianity I would say I know for sure, but what I don't know for sure is that if everyone has a salvation coming, but my inclination is that they do. There's many times it says in the Bible that Christ came for the whole world. In First John, John even emphasizes that he's the propitiation for our sins, not only for those which are exclusively our sins, but also for the whole
So
world. So he
you're-
uses more than one word to emphasize that it's not exclusively us. Like he emphasizes that this is not exclusive.
Right. That's universalism. You believe that everybody will be saved?
Yeah, I believe in both universalism and annihilism, which is what I explained earlier when I said that the person I used to be was annihilated. And I believe that that it's most likely that Christ has delivered that for everybody, from what I find in the text.
So I'm just trying to say that it seems like when you add in eternal life and things like that, that actually seems to cheapen life from my, at least at the here and now, in my perspective.
Yeah, and then when we get into the Christian perspective on it, we have the sanctity of life, where God says we're made in His image. So then, when you end a human life deliberately,
But it's not actually
it's
destroyed.
like smashing the image of God, and it's a crime against God.
I have to go later.
Okay, Brenda.
I have to go.
Well, thank you for cordial talking.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to get too far off on that tangent, but within the Christian theology, it seems like life is a little cheaper in that if you kill it, it's just gonna, especially if you kill it young, it's just gonna be saved anyway, and there's really no consequence, and you can be forgiven for it.
Yeah,
So it's
but
actually more important without a God to get this question right.
Yeah, I can agree that because Christ has reconciled these consequences, that that there's a beautiful thing there, that no matter how much we get things wrong, Christ reconciles it. But in our belief system, we don't think that that justifies the wrongdoing. And I mean, this philosophically and spiritually somewhat gets into what I wanted to debate with you next, which would be, was the snake right? And because Joshua said after his brothers captured him in a pit and sold him into slavery, and then Joshua became essentially royalty in Egypt. And
You mean Joseph?
Joseph, thank you. So Joseph became essentially royalty in Egypt. And then when his brothers came down with the entire tribe in order to have a better life there in Egypt, and they met Joseph, they were afraid he'd be angry, and he was just very glad to see them and very forgiving. And he said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good."
For good.
And so the fact that God comes through and is gracious and reconciles everything for us, it's expressed in the scriptures that does not justify evil. So this discussion of whether or not abortion is evil is still on the table.
And Romans talks about like the fact that just because grace abounds more when there's more sin does not give you liberty to then sin more so that grace will abound more.
Yeah, I'm not even saying it's justified. I just think it's less evil under to get this question wrong under Christian theology. Because in the end, you just go to heaven either way.
Well, it's less damaging, but if we're talking about
Yeah.
less just or more unjust or whatever, I mean, we're about to get into like the old presuppositional, you have no basis for any sort of justification for your morality. And I don't really want to jump onto that just yet because I'm still trying to address what you're saying about accidental pregnancies and how we should be allowed to reverse it.
And hey, I gotta head out too. So thanks for having me on.
See ya.
Thank you very much, Noah.
See ya.
And we should have this whole discussion separately, but what you said about was the snake right? Basically, all I mean by that is the knowledge of good and evil is a good thing. And we can unpack that all another time if you want, because it's probably going to take an hour at least
Yeah.
to really dig into it. But
I was thinking
just
that
wanted
could
to
be
say
our
something
next
real brief.
debate so that it wasn't like me explaining my perspective the whole time and you just getting to respond a little bit.
Yeah.
But this time you could keep describing why you think that. And then the only question about that is sort of how much are we going to reference the Bible in this? Because you get your snake image from the Bible, but it seems that you don't consider the Bible to be true. So it's more just where you pull your metaphor from. So then I don't know if discussing it in biblical terms would even, well, discussing it in biblical terms would just say where I'm coming from when I respond to you. So I guess that's sort of how the discussion will go, is we'll be discussing.
Well, it is a biblical reference, but kind of like with a wink and a nod. Like it's getting meta about it. It's kind of like a commentary on, well, you thought that this was one way, but it's really, if you look deeper, it's something else. And at least
so
in our culture, the Bible is kind of that bedrock that people tend to look to.
Yeah,
so it's kind of like flipping it on its head or looking at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, and with a different perspective on that, I mean, I'll definitely bring both the Bible to it. I'll bring the Bible to it a lot, but in direct response to the philosophical claims and all that. So, like, I think it'd be a very fun perspective to have that discussion on. And hopefully it'll just be something pretty entertaining for like your audience that you go by Snake was right and now you're having the debate. I think that I'm the appropriate opponent in that exact debate. Was the snake right? So yeah, I'd really like to do that if you'd be willing to.
Yeah, I don't think I've actually debated specifically that before. So yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, because there's still more that, like, more of my case to make that Jehovah is the God of Messiah and the God of Messiah is likely. But I felt that last time the focus was on me a lot, and I like to do my best to take turns with that focus. And that was when it occurred to me we could debate, was the snake right?
Nice. Yeah.
So regarding that people should be able to reverse it if the precautions fail. I don't think that this is very solid as far as arguing this, but I think it expresses a lot. So I like to describe this idea of a biological contract. It is very effective against the, I think it's the violinist analogy in support of abortion, which you can look up if you've never heard of it before. And
is this you get kidnapped for your organs to save the greatest violinist.
Yeah. And then so then this more when you start digging into that and the problems that come up with that, that was what inspired me to come up with this concept of biological contract. But the thing is that we only exist by the fact that the biological process exists. And we are born slaves to the biological facts. And yet the biology is also a slave to us. Like, it's not like the sperm has any ability to not fertilize the egg in some kind of decision-making way. So, I mean, we have no choice about being biologic, and biology has no choice about doing its thing to make us. So we're born into this this mandate of fact, and then part of that mandate of fact is the potential for pregnancy and the risk, even if trying to prevent pregnancy, to cause pregnancy. And so we have to accept that risk when we take it. And where I would bring that to is that then it becomes an argument about whether or not the life is worth protecting. So I don't really see how the idea of reversing an accident is relevant.
Well, I think it's relevant when it's a gradual process again. When it's not fully a person yet. That it really doesn't make a difference whether it never happened before or if you're just reversing it.
And then you talk about it being a gradual process, but let's think of like a wind-up toy. And you wind it up and you hold it so the gears are not moving at all. But there is a rather exact moment when you let go and there's a process and it's bouncing. And so, there's the sperm and egg, meat, and all of that is the precursor, the wind up. And then as soon as the cells are duplicating into cells that carry the necessary process to make a mature person, then you have that activity happening, like when you let go of the wind-up doll. And so I just find the analogy about building a house to be incorrect. Like, it's not analogous is what I mean by it's incorrect. Because I know all analogies fail somewhere, but my accusation here is that it's just not analogous.
Well, if you can't figure out where the house is there with something simple like that, I think it's harder to say that for a biological process.
Do you mind addressing the wind-up doll analogy? If there's a reason you think the house analogy is more relevant, that you can express that reason?
Why a wind-up doll is different than a house?
Well, I'm saying that the wind-up toy, I said doll, that's probably not the best word for the image I'm trying to convey, but the wind-up toys that when you let go of them, they bounce.
Yeah.
They like walk forward.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that's a better analogy because you have precursor and then you have automatic process beginning. And so with the building of a house, you don't have precursor and automatic process beginning. So that's my reasoning for why that analogy doesn't work. So I'd like you to address my analogy if you have a reason why it doesn't work or a reason why yours is better, rather than just repeating your analogy again.
Either one will fail because one, with the toy, it's already completed. Its structure is already there. I suppose if you wanted to fuse them, you could say you're building a wind-up toy. When is it complete? Is it complete when its internal parts that make it wind up
are complete, or
you have to put on all the plates Like if it's a robot or something?
Well, let's hold on here because I'm saying that the wind-up doll is analogous to express what I'm saying, that we can identify the moment that that process begins. Even though there's precursors to the process, we can identify precisely enough in order to apply it to laws about abortion. We can identify when that process begins precisely enough for the topic at hand.
Yeah,
And
I don't
so
think
so.
so.
The automatic process is what I am, and you've argued that then because of the automatic, the sperm and egg would have to also be there, or would have to also be included in that automatic process.
Well, there's some element of personal choice. Maybe the act of having sex is putting the toy together or something. But I think that the analogy isn't as clear as it might seem to you, because what are you saying is conception in the analogy? Is it when you let go of winding it up? Is it when you start winding it up?
The letting go is the cells duplicating, so the duplication process beginning.
Okay, because I would take it more as a conception would be the first turn that you crank it. And then the second term that you crank is another week in development.
that's
and
not
then
the
another
analogy.
turn is another week.
Now, the analogy I'm making is that when you let go of it, so it automatically moves forward, then that's analogous to the cells multiplying.
Okay, but I don't think the analogy works like that.
And my point is that we do have an identifiable moment. That's the point of the analogy, is to express how we have an identifiable moment.
But it matters how much you twist it too.
Yeah, I mean, analogies always break down at some point, but I'm speaking about the identifiable moment. So if you twist it less, it'll go less far. If we wanted to talk about miscarriage, maybe I could make it an analogy for that too. But I'm actually only using the analogy to talk about the moment the process begins being identifiable.
Well, there's another identifiable moment when the zygote splits into two cells. Why isn't it that moment instead?
Well, I mean, maybe that is the moment of multiplying that I'm talking about. And I think you might know the details of the biology better than I do. But I'm also saying that we're talking about precise enough for the topic of laws about abortion or morality about abortion. So we only need that level of precision.
Well, what I'm saying is there's a whole spectrum of identifiable moments that each moment doesn't really change the picture much. But when you add them up over time, it does.
Well, there's a certain moment when there is not the individual human, and then there's a moment when there is the individual human. And I'm not sure how precisely we can identify it, but we can accurately identify it at conception.
So what are you defining as a human? Just any cell with human DNA?
No, a human is
Because to me, it's
it,
not
it
a
is
it's not
the
a
animal.
complete human.
A human is the animal individual having, well, yeah, it's the animal individual when we're talking biologically.
Because going back to the wind-up thing, this egg won't develop on its own. It has to fuse with the female, the mother, and it becomes a part of her. So its individuality is a gradual process of separation.
Well, except that there's an extent, there's a lot of ways in which it is always separate. Like it always has a unique genome from the mother. So that's the thing is you keep bringing up a different issue, and I keep saying a way to identify regarding that specific issue that, well, we still have easy ways to identify these things, but then like now you could focus on genetics, and then you can say that multicellular, and then we keep, it's like instead of an attempt to hear and come to hearing what I'm saying and then address what I'm saying, it sounds like it's attempts to prevent from hearing. So I mean, I think the simplest thing I can say is that I think conception is easy enough to identify, and it's worth talking about conception instead of just trying to argue that we can't identify it.
Well, conception is identifiable, but why? But pegging conception as the point of individuality is what I'm objecting to.
Okay, and so
Because it's
in the
not that
womb-
clear cut.
in the womb, the child never shares the mother's blood, and in the womb, the child never shares the mother's genome. I mean, half of the genome came from her, but that's not the same thing as like cells from the mother's body that have only half of the same genome. They're not going to become part of the individual and keep going. So I mean, there are a number of markers by which they're never the same individual. If conception is individuality, what if the zygote splits to become identical twins?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then I would just say that both of them are individual and humans and alive and are worthy of being protected. And this is what I mean by trying to dodge the point of a discussion with things that are absolutely beside the point. Like if I was trying to prove that I am capable of using words to technically describe things, then I might be falling short. But I'm not really trying to prove my ability to technically describe things. I'm just doing my best to communicate something. And that something is that we do have an identifiable moment that a human life begins. And
But
Yeah,
that
I
is a
mean-
good point because you can't identify whether it's two lives or one life at that point.
well, if it's two, we have two that are worth protecting. If it's one, we have one that's
But
worth
it's not
protecting.
identifiable.
Yeah, in context of this discussion, it's still an identifiable moment of human life. And it's still identifiable as not egg, not sperm, and not mother.
So, and then the question becomes, does that even matter?
Exactly. But there's like so much going around and around the topic of does it matter? And then
Yeah,
I
because
don't know if
it's
we have
it's
much
not.
more. I don't know if we have much more to say about how much it matters or not, because the biblical perspective is very obvious that God makes humans in his image and he's the judge. So then I'm not going to look at a human life and say, well, I'll judge whether or not it should be protected now. And from the biblical viewpoint, it's even easier than that because we're to be fruitful and multiply, and life is a blessing. And so even the use of contraception shows confusion in the mind of the person who would want to do that, because you would want to have fewer children. Our society today is structured so that children are a burden, but it used to be structured that children were an asset, and which probably sounds objectionable to some people, like they're your asset. You're going to use them to do work and stuff. But I mean, it's symbiosis, really, you know? It's just. So when we bring things down to, you know, in God's way, it all works together very well. But then I could even step back to just philosophically and say that I would rather protect human life than put myself in a place to judge when it's worthy of protection.
Well, I mean, then there's the flip side of that is if we legally don't allow abortions, then you are endangering a lot more people, in fact, because a lot of those same women are just going to abort their child anyway. But what you've done is take away any safe options of that, and you're taking away mothers and sisters and daughters out of the population if you're going to arrest them, and that could destroy families even further and put them in a violent prison situation. If you charge people for this act, and you're also potentially, if it's not safe, then she's at risk of killing herself, or even the abortion not working and the child being born with deformities. So it seems like legally, if you don't allow abortion, you're doing more harm than good. And if we're assuming a Christian theology, then essentially the consequences aren't even that bad, because we're not actually eliminating a life. The life goes on forever in heaven. So it doesn't seem like there's any good justifiable way to regulate this legally. While it might not be ideal to just start killing things for convenience, ideally you could let everything live. You wouldn't need to kill it.
Yeah, and that's the pragmatic approach, where we're saying that, like, I mean, it sounds like that's granting for the sake of discussion that there is something wrong with the abortion, but then giving other reasons why it would be too dire a consequence to have laws around that.
Well, I technically think ending even the life of a bacterium has something wrong with it. It's not very major, but at least from my moral model, ending any type of life is a little bit wrong. But there are times when it's justified.
And then yeah, and this is where, I mean, because you're very smart and bright and philosophically capable, and yet you because your worldview isn't able to be consistent with recognizing that killing bacteria is irrelevant morally, but killing humans is morally wrong. You've been reduced to making a silly ethical claim like that.
Well, it's not inconsistent because it's based on your level of personhood. So bacterium has almost no level of personhood whatsoever, if any.
But in order to stay consistent, you've had to go to a silly place.
How is personhood silly?
Well, this idea that there is something wrong with killing bacteria, I find that silly. So that's why I'm calling it silly.
Why is it silly to end the existence of a thing? I think the ending of anything is technically wrong. It has to be.
I think that really shows an inability to assess values well. And,
well, there's a scale of how valuable a thing is. Like if you obliterate a rock, well, big deal. But if the rock was the only thing that ever existed, that's better than nothing existing at all. So that rock should exist.
Yeah, and then we're in this whole subjective area because rocks can be built into walls and beautiful castles and mansions, but has there been a slight moral wrongdoing in exchange for a better, something, a slight destruction of value of the rock just sitting there to perhaps a higher value of putting it into a castle wall and this and that. And these sorts of emotional, subjective ways of looking at value, or
Well, there's
for me,
nothing subjective or emotional about it. A rock objectively is more valuable than nothing.
well, I don't agree. Well, I don't agree with that. Just a rock. If the whole universe is nothing but one rock, not even a sentient God to be aware the rock is there, nothing but a rock, then I think that is of the exact same value as nothing.
Well, that's subjective. Whether someone is there to enjoy it or not is irrelevant. The rock does more than nothing.
So what's this objective definition of value?
Well,
Because I'm
nothing.
surprised you said it was objective.
Well, it is. Nothing does nothing and can do nothing and has no qualities. A rock exists and it has the qualities of matter and rocks.
Yeah,
so
so
it
it
objectively has more value
it
and
objectively
more
has
qualities and
measure.
more values than nothingness.
It has objectively more measure. Like it's we can measure things. So I would agree there's a greater measure, but I don't think measure is when we're talking about moral values or values of appreciation. I don't see how that correlates with measure.
Well, when I say value, I mean the dictionary definition of value is of the usefulness of something.
Okay, and then but
So basically
then
what
we're
it
looking at the
does,
definition of useful.
whatever it does. Anything and everything it can do.
And then if we are talking about that as the definition of value, then I would have to say that's not moral value. That would be the end justifies the means. And so I disagree.
On the basis that that morality is somehow different from truth.
Well, the dictionary is, it's giving us. Dictionary definitions themselves are subjective. So if we're trying to communicate what we're talking about, then
Yeah, but that's what I mean when I use that word.
What I would need help understanding your use of the word value in this context, I would need that to be reconciled with this concept about the end justifying the means. Now, you may think the end does justify the means, and if so, then that's consistent enough with what you're saying. But if you don't think the end justifies the means, then moral value is not directly correlated with usefulness in just a broad objective sense. Rather, we have a subjective, what's useful. Moral value is how useful is this for moral gain, rather than just objective value, how useful it is for objective gain.
Well, I think in some cases the ends can justify the means, like killing for self-defense. The killing is wrong, but defending your life is more important than preserving someone else's life if they've started the aggression.
Okay,
so in a way, I mean, they've broken this social contract, which I guess I would look at it more as like a logical contract. So it's not a contract, but they've broken a logical way of behaving. So you are justified in taking the means of taking a life in order to preserve your own life, because you haven't broken the logical code. Only that other person has, though.
Yeah, and you appealed to you appealed to social contracts and things, which I think is a little different than end justifying the means.
Well, I actually kind of recanted social contract, but I guess it's kind of a way to introduce the subject.
Yeah, I think it kind of shows some of the difference in what we're talking about. But let's step back from end justifies the means and talk about the difference between just we'll call it objective value and moral value. And so for me, the
Yeah,
and we
I think the
go
state
ahead.
that something is in determines how much value or personhood it has. Like a rock does not have personhood. A
Oh,
dog,
I remember what we were talking about.
a
I
dog would
said,
have a little bit.
you say a
Go
dog would
ahead.
have a little bit?
I'd say a dog is on the lower end of a person,
Yeah, and
whereas humans are more basically the pinnacle of a person that we know of. There could be aliens that have more awareness than a human, or some kind of supernatural being that has more awareness than a human. But even having awareness at all gives it this baseline value that needs to be respected above an inanimate object.
yeah, and we're back on the topic of personhood. And like I said, person means fourth sound. So that's why like the father is a spirit, but he's a person. And yet like my personhood is a spirit that is in an animal body. And so my personhood doesn't come from my animal body. But the life of a human, we do have an animal moment when that begins. And just to speak about dogs being persons, dogs do sound forth a personality. So you know, we deem it murder to kill people.
Well, let's say the soul is kind of the seat of personhood. That there's something about the soul that gives it that personhood, whereas it's conscious. It has the capacity to reason or feel, things like that. Would you agree with that? Like that's what gives a soul its value, if there is a soul.
Um, what gives a person its personhood is that sound, which it is that harmony, which it is sounding forth. So person means fourth sound, and like the universe is the one song of everything, the one harmony of everything. So that's where the word universe comes from. If you remember our discussion and our debate, um, where I talked a lot about harmony and stuff, I didn't use the etymological connection, which would have been a fallacy in that context. But it does show that I'm not the first person to think this way, obviously. And so, fourth sound, person, and God made us in his image. So, really, everything is because the voice of God is fourth sounding. So, in that sense, everything has a personhood. And then you could start to say, well, God also fourth sounded the rock, so it has certain value based on that. And it's interesting because in a lot of ways this sounds incredibly similar to what you're saying, except that God also fourth sounded that he made man in his image. And there are abstract conceptual spirits. And so, yeah, what you're saying about consciousness, yeah, we don't worry about hurting a rock because the rock does not experience the pain of being hurt, but then a dog does experience the pain of being hurt. And then the question is like, we're much less merciful with, say, insects, which also experience the pain of being hurt. And then we can get to the point of a bacteria. And so, I guess what I said about it, it sounds silly to me to bring up bacteria having value in context of debating whether or not abortion is wrong, even though as we go into philosophizing more for the purpose of philosophizing, I am starting to see how my worldview is very similar to that in some ways. But I still think that making any connection between that and abortion comes to a point of silliness.
Well, the reason I bring that up is because trying to assess the value and personhood of a various stages of human development. But kind of what I was getting at with the souls is there must be some reason that God values a soul. And I would say it's because of what it can do. It can think, it can reason, it can feel. And that's more than, I mean, even if you grant that a rock has a soul, that's more than a rock's soul can do. So I think when, if you're going to say that a human zygote or fetus has a soul, then either it's conscious from the moment of conception, or that soul itself has the same level of personhood sophistication as just the materials of that zygote has, because it's certainly not capable of consciousness at the point of just being one or two cells. And eventually it may become there, it may get there, but it seems like even invoking a soul doesn't really solve how far along on personhood development it is.
Yeah, so and my perspective is not concerned about personhood.
I think that's just the way that we can measure like how much value that it has, so that we can make judgment calls of like, okay, what kind of ethics can we use for this thing?
Now, when you say measure, you mean quantify, like express it in a quantitative way? Because I don't think we can measure personhood.
I think it's difficult, but you can do it, because you can say, I mean, you can get real technical, like with how many neural connections, how technically you can measure the actual reasoning, but there are rougher ways to do it, like, is it capable of reasoning at all? Where a bacterium has some sort, it can interact with its environment, but and some people might say, it behaves somewhat intelligently, in that its behavior will do beneficial things for it, but I wouldn't say that it's conscious or that it can actually reason. But like, well, just talking about the same species, I guess a human zygote isn't conscious, but a human baby is conscious.
Okay, I see. I do have to admit that I see why that seems very compelling. The only thing is that consciousness is so complex that I don't think we can have a specific point to deem consciousness, and we don't have any way to define, well, consciousness. I presume we are in agreement that consciousness talks about the experience of experiencing.
Yeah, like even Aaron Ra, I think it was the other day, he said something like even a single cell or a rock is conscious at some very, very simplistic level. And I would actually, at least for the sake of communication, I would disagree with that, because I do agree that consciousness would be an experience, and a subjective one. But I do kind of see what he's saying, that there's an input output kind of thing going on.
He just got put into a corner, I think, in that debate and slipped up. To be honest, I don't really think that he has become a panpsychist or anything.
Well, I see what he's saying. I just
rather
feel like the language
person.
is not sufficient. I see what he's saying, but I don't think the language is quite sufficient to. I think it's a bit of a stretch.
When we talk about the experiencing of the experiencer, and it's like, it's just, well, I think we have an agreement about what consciousness is, and we could use the word awareness of experience, but then how do you define awareness? But I guess we could say that no matter how confused and mysterious the awareness is, we're still talking about awareness. So then we could say awareness of experience. So that like insects appear to have an awareness of experience, and bacteria do not appear to have an awareness of experience. So it would appear that insects are conscious and bacteria are not conscious. Are we working with the same definition of conscious here?
I think so.
Okay.
Though I would say it's still a continuum. It's like there's almost no point where you can say that it's off, other than, I think, inanimate objects. Whereas a bacterium would have the tools that a more sophisticated organism might use. And then, I don't know, a caterpillar might be a couple steps up, but it's still, I don't think it has any internal thoughts. It's more just reacting. Like, bugs are probably closer to robots than actual consciousness, but they're probably able to sense some very primitive form of fear and pain. Although how much that's actually
my high school biology
aware of it's really hard to tell.
Well, my high school biology teacher was a very good teacher, and he told me that ants have brains, and fairly complex brains. And so when we're talking about the difference between bacteria and insects, we're talking about one that does not have brain and one that does have brain. But then we're getting to like a whole nother discussion about what consciousness is. Because if one thinks that consciousness arises as a result of the physical brain, then there are other physical organizations of information which already exist in the I just realized that Johan's probably never knew about the link here, and I could have posted a link for him. But to be perfectly honest, Johan's the stream's already been up for 3 hours, and I'm thinking maybe for future audiences, I don't know if I want to jump back into repeating the topics that we discussed when you weren't here. So since I'm looking at winding down, I'm not going to post the link for you, Johan's. But I would like you to be here some other time in the future. I'm doing a live stream every day now, so it'll be tomorrow at 5:30. So you can subscribe, or if you don't want to subscribe, you can just show up or something. And I'll be reading a journal entry at the beginning of each live stream, and then if anyone's there and wants to have open mic discussion, I'll be inviting them in. So yeah, Johans, I'm not going to invite you in now because I'm going to wind this down, but you are definitely invited in the future. And yeah, so we were just talking about consciousness, brains, not brains, information organization. So yeah, if we think consciousness arises from information organization, but there's really something very special about how we're aware that's very separate from physical experience. Like consciousness, in some sense, is abstract.
Sure. I was gonna say, I think plants are maybe a gray area where you could make an argument that they're conscious, but at like maybe the most base level, because they are able to react to even music, and they move towards sunlight. There's certain music that makes plants grow better. I think even there was an experiment where they moved towards the music or something like that.
Yeah, and I think
And there's some evidence that they respond to pain in a certain way and can even communicate with each other. And there's some really interesting stuff about how they have relationships with fungus too, where there's this whole fungus network under the forest, and the fungus kind of acts as like a banker. The trees will give them sugar, and the fungus will take the sugar and distribute it, and they'll give it to plants that are struggling. And it's like this whole complex relationship. And they're communicating with each other, and they're talking, and they're doing these complex trade-offs, but they're probably not aware in the sense that we mean, you know?
Yeah, and from, I don't want to be promoting like promoting a new age approach. I don't mind having agreements with the new age or anything like that, but I think it's very important that the approach to truth to benefit people is that Messiah demonstrated his worthiness on the cross. And so before I keep delving into these topics, I just want to really emphasize that point, that Messiah on the cross is how we can have a basis to start measuring other things that we value, so forth, so on, etc. Not pushing that at you, Snake, but just putting that out there before I talk too much on this new agey sounding stuff, because
Well, I think it's just to demonstrate that it's a spectrum. It's not just on or off.
yeah, and I would think that the consciousness that plants have, they have these robotic type responses and stuff, and I do think that there is also a consciousness there, but that consciousness is owned and perceived by Christ, is what I would propose, that Christ is that universal consciousness, and then animals are given each their own, presumably their own individual consciousness, and humans are definitely each given each an individual consciousness, which brings up a very interesting question of like, are some of these animals going to be annihilated, or or is there going to be a huge population of animals in the new Earth, or is maybe their consciousness really is just temporary for the purpose of being animals, and then
you're saying that this soul enters at conception, right?
You see, I think spirit is probably the better word, because soul in the scripture really refers to self-expression. And we see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when it says the first Adam was made a living breath, a living soul. But the second Adam was made a life-giving breeze, or a life-giving gust or ghost, a life-giving spirit. And so the difference there is that when we express ourselves as not being a part of God, but being individual and in rebellion against God, then that's the soul, that's the self-expression, the breath, the exhale, and the spirit is the inspiration, the inhale. So spirit, respiration, inspiration, these words are all closely related. So so talking about the soul entering,
Because I think,
and
at
I'm
least
just
for
having
the
trouble. I'm just having trouble talking on this middle point, because it's easier to talk about the surface, or it's easier to talk about the depth of spirituality, but where they meet, I'm struggling to talk about.
yeah, it's hard because it's a gradual. So I think for the purposes here, consciousness could be understood best as more of an awareness of one's surroundings, so that even though it's there's kind of a spectrum where you could say insects, even plants, have some sort of primitive consciousness. I don't think that that's I think that's on the edge of what we're talking about, but it kind of relates to this development of a fetus too, because it's like they start off with none to the most primitive form of consciousness, and it's a gradual process towards this type of consciousness that we describe as an awareness, or as the consciousness of a person. And I
Yeah.
think that the consciousness of a person is what needs to be protected more so than these other more primitive forms.
Yeah, and this is something I'd have to meditate on a lot, as far as if using common ground, I can make this case for against abortion based on sanctity of life. Because if someone wants to say sanctity of consciousness instead of sanctity of life, then I would at least, even in that context, I would say, okay, for you, speaking to you, who thinks life is not necessarily sacred on that level, but consciousness is, then I suggest, for your own self-consistency, that you are very careful that if consciousness has possibly started to exist in the developing child, that you would then cut it off, then the deadline for whether or not you would consider abortion possibly viable.
Yeah, I think that you could easily make a case for cutting it off earlier than 28 weeks, because I think the brain is there a little bit before then. But I think right before you get a brain is a pretty safe place to cut it off, because as far as we know, there's no consciousness without a brain. And even if there's a soul before there, apparently the soul doesn't have a consciousness either at that point. So the soul itself is developing in tandem with the body.
Yeah, well, that's also another interesting point, is that does our consciousness only experience our brain, or is there also direct experience between the consciousness and the body? And I guess that's a matter of the nervous system. We do know that our consciousness only experiences the nervous system at most. And we always talk about the signals from the nervous system reaching the brain. But, and maybe I just don't know the science well enough, but I do wonder if the awareness might actually reach into the nervous system rather than the signals actually having to reach the brain. But I guess for most people, there's enough evidence that signals reach the brain, and that's how this awareness works. And there's probably experiments based on like poking people and things, and then giving them drugs and poking. I don't know, just different experiments where they work out that the brain is key to that. So I'm probably in the wrong direction with this point that I'm talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours just about, consciousness being tied to the brain.
Yeah, and then so well, I wouldn't tie consciousness to the brain. The way I would say it is that the consciousness experiences the brain. The brain and is custom designed to be a suitable interface for consciousness. But the consciousness, I would say, is transcendent. And so I am going, there's an eternal me. And whether that eternal me exists in an eternity that is not this, because what we're in now is temporal, or there's another possibility that the eternal me exists for all of time also, so already exists, but I am not yet experiencing that other aspect of my existence. And so consciousness and all of this is an extremely subjective and potentially religious topic to get into. But God owns every human being. And so the only thing I really need to meditate on and see is if what I can do to get more agreement based on secular common ground, secular being without regard to religion. But ultimately, like, I really have this in a much easier place because Jehovah, Yeshua, the Messiah, the one God, he owns every human being. And so as soon as a human being is formed, he owns it. So then whether it has consciousness yet or not, whether this human is just a lump of cells or not, we require God's permission in order to justify killing it. And so, for instance, like the Torah was given and there's death penalty for murder. And so then following through with the death penalty is not murder. And that is based on God's permission. And so,
Well, I guess I
the
would
only
just
way to
say,
change my mind would be to find where in Scripture God gives permission for people to decide that the human would be inconvenient and they can kill it.
well, I guess I have two things to say then. I would say if God doesn't want it to be killed, he could just will the abortion instruments to not harm it. And two, there is, I don't know exactly the verse. I can probably get it for you real quick, but
Are Are you
There is
going to
a
talk about
verse.
the adultery verse where
The
she's made to take the bitter drink if her
yes,
husband thinks she committed adultery?
yeah.
Yeah, that's why I chose my words carefully, because no matter how one's interpreting that section, it has nothing to do with permission to end the human because it might be because of inconvenience. So
I think adultery would be an inconvenience.
the Torah there is, you see, when we interpret Torah, we are to see what it's intending to tell us and go from there. And the Torah is not intending to send a message about if a conceived human life is inconvenient. What the Torah is doing there is how to deal with an irreconcilable suspicion of adultery. And it's one of those things that was put there for the hardness of hearts. This is stuff that Messiah made very clear in his earthly ministry with examples. And so we are to notice what Messiah intended and apply that, principle about hardness of heart to understand that God's not saying, he's not validating the suspicion of adultery for the hardness of heart that this situation came up, either because the husband was suspicious when he shouldn't be, or because the wife actually committed adultery, or something in between where something went on that does seem suspicious. So the wife let the appearance of evil happen. It's written in the scripture to not even give the appearance of evil. So that would still be a valid place to mark where the mistake occurred, the hardness of heart occurred. So my point there, I went into the hardness of heart to solidify my point, or to keep it from being seen as justifying something that's unjust. But my point is that the purpose of that is to handle reconciling suspicion of adultery. It's not to express what can be done if a child is inconvenient.
Well, it is a specific circumstance, but it is basically killing off the unwanted child because the husband doesn't want an illegitimate child.
Except that in the text, God promises that if she committed adultery, then okay, I see what you're getting at, because God promises that if she committed adultery, there'll be no child, and if she did not commit adultery, then there will still be a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, and you did manage to bring me to one of the very most difficult spots in Torah, but that's fine. I'm gonna think about it for a few seconds here, but I may not be able to sufficiently address this. Yeah, I mean, I cannot sufficiently. I mean, the only thing I can say is that there is a lot of death penalties in Israel. There was no prison system. So things were either civil penalties, death penalties, or servitude penalties. And the death penalties were for the purpose of preserving Israel as a specific sort of nation. Um, for instance, there was one time when someone broke Sabbath and the people had to stone him to death. And of course, no one wanted to. But like, I wouldn't be keeping Sabbath today if they had not stoned that person to death. Like, there would have been no consequence to Sabbath, and people would have dropped the Sabbath. And then Israel would not have been the expression that God was making Israel into. So these are matters that God owned Israel and was able to, he has the right as God to do anything and had the right to use death to ensure Israel's usefulness to him.
So
And
the
then,
the ends justify the means.
well, the justification is that God is their creator and their redeemer, and he is their life and he owns them. And so it comes down to property rights, and then we could argue about whether or not God has just right to those property rights. But so it's not about the end justifying the means, it's about he owns beforehand, so it's justified beforehand, not based on the ends. And then if God is going to make certain judgment calls, that he's going to do things to certain ends, then because what Christian morality actually comes down to is obeying Christ. And most of what that comes down to is obeying Torah, even though most Christians would disagree with that. But we understand Torah by the spirit of what's written, not by the letter of what's written. And Christ added to the Torah, and a lot of what he added was mercy and forgiveness. Because he has forgiven us, we must forgive others. And because he has mercy towards us, we must have mercy towards others. And he used the cross to express this. And that's why being a good person and caring about other people in that spirit of loving your neighbor, they are absolutely correct that is the more important aspect of Torah. And so if someone's going to if someone's going to not eat pork, like I don't eat pork because it's written that pork's not food for us, then
Do you not eat shellfish either?
yeah, I don't eat shellfish.
Oh man.
So that's those are the less weighty matters of the law. And then mercy and forgiveness are weightier matters of the law. But before Christ came and they had the law according to Moses, then there was certain purposes in that, but they were still supposed to do weightier matters first, like loving the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, and mind, and loving their neighbor as their self. And so, for instance, loving the Lord my God. So by worshiping truth, I know that adultery is wrong. And the recognition of that is that I know I would be worthy of death, just as that's written as the death penalty. And then, loving my neighbor as myself, it's like I don't expect, at this point, I don't expect death penalty over the adulteries I've committed, nor would I put that on my neighbor. And this whole concept of being worthy of death is applied equally to myself and my neighbor. But ultimately, I think we're looking at the loving God part of this is why Israel had to have death penalties for certain things so that they could express righteousness. But not only that, but that loved the whole world. Like modern human rights absolutely would not be what they are today if we had the legacy of Rome without the Christian influence. It's the light of the cross that took the legacy of Rome that has become the modern global world that we have today and reformed it enough that we have human rights and things like that. And that required Israel. And
well, I think that
so
required
where
the
it comes
Reformation of the Enlightenment too.
And well, yeah, but that also comes from the light of the cross. And the Enlightenment happened 2,000 years ago on the cross. People were just stubborn about it. They finally give in, finally, and it's probably the pressure of Christ's kingdom on earth that forced the elitists to finally stop being so stubborn and to finally let the Enlightenment happen after 1500 plus years of not letting it happen because they're greedy. And so, yeah, the credit to the Enlightenment is very falsely placed when it's placed in the 15, 16, 1700s, whenever someone wants to put it. And but that's my point, is that that's the loving the neighbor as yourself part of the death penalties in Israel, is that now we have 8 billion people, most of whom on some level are benefiting from Israel. So we are the neighbors who are being loved by what went on in Israel. And there's more clarity brought to that if we talk about the wars between the lesser gods and Jehovah and all that. And I'd love to have that talk sometime. But that's one of those topics that would be too big to dig into
Yeah,
at the moment.
yeah. I think getting back to the abortion, I think to kind of wrap it all up, I think with all we've talked about, that the pragmatic argument is probably, if we're going to be uncertain about everything else that we've talked about, I think the pragmatic argument, along with the fact that if Christianity is true, then there's even less harm being done.
Well, if
That
Christianity
it's just more pragmatic to allow it to be legal, because we're going to have more overall societal harm being done if we're going to step in, because it's kind of like adultery, like
Christianity is true,
like,
because if Christianity is true, then God owns the human life as soon as it becomes a human life, and we have to find permission in the scriptures. So
yeah, I'm not saying that it's good, just that it's ultimately you're not snuffing out something out of existence.
I'm saying the pragmatic argument does not hold any merit if Christianity is true. So mixing the two, and God commands us against a mixture, and I think spiritually that very much applies here. That's the intention of that. So I'm just objecting to including Christianity in that. I'm not trying to shut you up.
Well, I think it does, because we would have a worse society. Plus, the soul still exists.
Yeah, as far as having a better society, obedience to Christ on every level would make such a better society. But when we do mixture, when we talk about hypothetically, if we changed only one thing, then yeah, we're still in the whole sin problem.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like adultery. Like, I think generally people do have certain arrangements where they're what do you call it? Polyamorous.
Yeah.
But generally, cheating on your spouse, lying to your spouse, is an unethical thing to do. But what would be worse for society is giving the power to the police to knock down your door and arrest you for lying to your spouse. Like, that would just make things so much more complicated on every level, and just introduce more excuse for evils either way. So there is an argument for a necessary evil, I suppose.
Yeah, and so this is the topic that we're probably going to be digging into a whole lot when we debate, was the snake right? So I look forward to that. And unless you have last words specifically on abortion.
I think that was about it. And I think we might want to kind of double up that next conversation with maybe examining a model of morality, or that might be a topic unto its own. But
Yeah, we've seen with what we're talking about now that for me and you specifically, you know, we're like the dark and light of the same coin to some extent, it seems. So it's easy for you and I to have lots and lots of really deep discussion. So I don't think we're going to have any problem. You know, the issue of was the snake right is a spiritual issue. And so we're not going to have any problem getting into all sorts of relevant and interesting discussion on that.
For sure.
Yeah, so I don't think we need to define the topic anymore. I think that's exactly the topic that I'd like to debate with you. Besides giving more of my arguments in favor of Messiah, the other topic I'd like to debate, is was the snake right? And you know, I'll debate it in somewhat in the biblical terms, and I'll debate it plenty in the terms that you're expressing as your perspective.
Yeah, much to talk about. It's a very
Okay,
rich subject.
So I'm going to give my outro now. And I
All
think
right.
what I discovered from all this discussion is that I'll have to meditate to see what the best case I can give for the sanctity of life is on secular common ground. But ultimately, where I have firm ground to stand on is on Messiah. And, you know, this is why my name is Proclaimer of Messiah. And this is one reason why I think presuppositional apologetics is not the only apologetics, but it's a necessary step in the sense that getting to that spiritual place that Messiah is ruler. It's not my philosophy. It's not what I've learned, you know, Gnosticism, what I've learned even based on Messiah. It's not my ability to argue it logically or something. Ultimately, Messiah is everything. And if I'm unable to fully, you know, express that abortion is unjustified without standing on Messiah and saying, well, I would have to have his permission because he owns that human, then I'm totally fine with that because I'm very big on this extremely Messiah centric. And Messiah means Christ, by the way, if anyone who listens to this at some point doesn't know that. So for me, it's not only that I promote Messiah centric Christianity, but there is no other Christianity. To whatever extent you start trusting something else, you start relying on something else, then it's that much less Christian. Like my rebirth into truth, my rebirth into Christ completely changed my ability to think, how good I was at learning and everything. And so even my perspective of logic, I mean, that basically hasn't changed because I was already logical, but I had to retest it and see if logic is okay with Christ. You know what I mean? And so it comes to the point that the very basic that we can build anything else on has to be Christ. He is the cornerstone, he is the foundation. Those are both scriptural images. He is the root of David. And so in whatever failure I've had here, I would just claim that glorifies Christ, how much we need him. And so I'm perfectly content with any falling short that I did here. And that is all that I have for this live stream. I'll read what you said, Johans, real quick. My grandson there. It's not a comfortable thing. People talking, taking it when. So I'll put Johans on the screen. He was a good audience member for a long time. And he very much agrees with what Snake says. And yeah, so this sort of thing, it might just be a call to how we can't really compromise, with secular worldviews, and we can't really like take up academia and somehow think that we're gonna help people see the truth through that, and we're not gonna help people see the truth through philosophy. And I mean, these can be tools to help show that Christ is stronger than secularism, that Christ is righter than secularism. That, for instance, if there's a debate going on and one side can't be consistent, or one side seems to be trapped into a corner of perhaps silly or absurd conclusions or something, and that's the only way they can remain consistent. Or just if one side, is distasteful and you have this intuition, and then if that side that's more tasteful, that's better and stuff, is the Christian side, then that speaks well of Christ. And in philosophy and debates and stuff, really, anytime we're going to go to common ground, that's really the best we can do, is just kind of show, well, look, the Christian did better than the other guy. And that doesn't bridge us all the way to Messiah, So presuppositional apologetics is kind of that last step where it's like, okay, we've argued to this point, but then you don't actually have any foundation for that point. And I didn't go that way with Snake Was Right here. I didn't go the presuppositional final step. I continued discussion with him, and we have a lot of common ground, Snake and I. But at the same time, like, we're fundamentally different ways. And he's a nice guy, and like, yeah, I don't know much about his personal life, but I have no reason to think he's out there being any more harmful than me or anything. So then how can it be that I'm claiming we're fundamentally different ways? And there's something deep down in spiritual acknowledgement of the one true God, and in the spiritual truth of Christ and Messiah, that it's spirit. It's not something that I know how to put into words easily. It's like every day I'm using different words with different people all the time, speaking on it more and more, and I'm never expressing it fully. That just never happens. But there's his spirit has been put inside me, and in that I can see the spiritual fundamental difference, that no matter how much it looks similar, it's not. So Messiah is, when God said, "This is my only begotten Son in whom I am well pleased," he actually said what that means exactly is, "This is my one unique Son in whom I am well pleased." And Messiah is just so unique and so divine. And that is what I'm going to end this on. So praise be to Messiah, and put your trust in him. When you trust him and you act on that trust, then you receive the benefits of that trust, and you get shalom, the one true peace that only Messiah can give.